vision of the future of the internet from the past. Vint Cerf, the father of the internet, in this episode of The Interview. Yes, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, myself, Ewan, Spence, welcoming you back into my personal archive in The Interview. Which does sound rather ominous, doesn't it? Hey, it's The Interview! Take your pick. Anyway, yes, it's The Interview is a podcast where I take time to revisit many of the people that I've spoken to over the last 2 decades of podcasting. So, in this episode, back to 2017, where I had the chance to speak to Vint Cerf at the IEEE Tech For Humanity conference. Cerf, along with Bob Kahn, developed TCP/IP, the communication protocol that lies at the very heart of the internet. You're using it right now. And without TCP/IP, nothing works, nothing connects. And it's one of the reasons why many people call Cerf and Kahn the fathers of the internet. When he joined Google, after he was talked out of his first choice of a job role as Archduke, he was given the title of Chief Internet Evangelist, which sums up his life's goal rather well. In this interview, we talk about the design of the internet, how its open nature was achieved, reaching the last billion users, and using the internet for the good of humanity. It's a fascinating interview. And then, of course, it was to think about what was on the horizon, what was coming up. Now, 7 years later, how accurate was that vision and how far do we still have to go? How much of this is a path we have followed and is the road not travelled? All of that in The Interview. Who originally connected the world, or at least had a large part to play in it, joins me now. Vint Cerf with one of the most impressive titles I have seen for a long time. Chief Internet Evangelist.
That would be me.
And all you want to talk about is my kilt.
Yes, because my family has roots back in Scotland and Ireland, and I've always wanted a kilt, and I don't have one.
What I think I have one is a chance to ask somebody who is a building block of the internet, who's great fun to talk to, has many stories, and is still looking to affect change at an individual level around the world. Vint, for our listeners, why are you so important?
I don't consider myself to be important.
Okay, in that case then, why does everybody at IEEE and everybody else think you're so important?
I don't know. Maybe they've been imbibing something. Look, part of this is just because I've been around for a very long time, and Bob Kahn and I, and many others, were part of this story very early on in the 1970s, over 40 years ago. And by good fortune, I'm still alive and I'm still kicking, and I have the benefit of being able to engage still in seeing the internet continue to propagate. Eric Schmidt, the chairman of Google, and I have offices adjacent to each other. We never see each other because we're both traveling all the time. But at one point, he announced that I wasn't allowed to retire. And I said, why not? And he said, because you're only half done. Only 50% of the world is online, and you have another 3.5 billion people to go. So I've been fortunate to have been allowed to pursue the further spread of the internet and its use and application. And when you think about it, look at how many people have contributed to its utility. Think of Tim Berners-Lee, of course, in the World Wide Web, which made this vastly easier to use, easier to create information on it, to share it, and of course the search engines that let you find it. So this amazing influx of creativity and inventiveness is invited by the fact that the internet is such an open environment. And it was designed purposefully to be that open. It was also designed in such a way that it wasn't, there were no barriers to its uptake. When Bob Kahn and I actually seriously thought about whether it should be patented and concluded that it should not, because we didn't want to have any excuses for the computer companies in particular to reject the use of the internet protocols. on the grounds that they had their own proprietary ones, which they did at the time. IBM had SNA, Digital had DECnet, Hewlett-Packard had DS, which I think stood for Distributed Systems. And so we wanted them not to have the excuse that there was some barrier that would interfere with their ability to implement the TCP/IP protocols. And so that initial impetus and the subsequent institutions that have been created as part of the Internet universe have all had this open participatory quality to them. The Internet Engineering Task Force, for example, where the standards are made, you can't actually join the task force. All you can do is show up. And so there isn't a membership list. And that's exactly as it should be. And you don't even actually have to physically show up because an awful lot of the work is done online through email distribution lists and now increasingly video conferencing. So from my point of view, the opportunity to keep encouraging people to build and use the Internet is a gift. And, why would I not want to keep doing that?
Is it a sense of it's not really a job that you retire from, but it's more your calling?
Yes, and I suppose with my title, calling would be appropriate. Although, by the way, I didn't ask for that title. When I joined Google, they said, "What title do you want?" And I thought about it, and I said, "How about Archduke?" So I thought that was a great title. And they said, well, the previous Archduke was Ferdinand, and he was assassinated in 1914, and it started World War I. Maybe that's a bad title to have. Why don't you be our Chief Internet Evangelist? And I said, okay, I can do that.
So there we are. So you managed to save us from World War III for the moment.
Let's hope so. Certainly not in my lifetime, right?
And that's why you can't retire. That's why you can't die. You're the totem. As long as you're around, Vince, we're good to go. But you zeroed in there. There's still another 3.5 billion people to connect.
Yes.
And the Internet is built on this lovely 80-20 rule. The first 80% is really easy and takes 20% of the time. The last 20% is the hard bit and takes 80% of the time.
Actually, it's worse than that. The first 90% takes 90% of the time, and the last 10% takes the other 90% of the time. So the math never quite works out. So the answer to that question, implicit question, is that physics is with us here. The cost of equipment and the cost of communications is coming down. And so you can watch the leading edge of access to Internet partly as a function of disposable GDP or disposable income. And as the incomes rise or as the costs drop, the leading edge continues to be able to absorb and make use of Internet. That doesn't mean that we should just sit back and relax. What it means is we should keep pushing to get costs down and to find ways of improving personal income. We look at poverty in the world and, we sort of despair at all the challenges that it represents. And yet, as Eric Schmidt points out, for businesses, revenue is the solution to everything, and income in many ways is the solution to everything. Instead of giving people things, if they can earn enough, then they can pay for them, and that's an economic engine that is self-sustaining. The other is not. And so anything that we could do to make the Internet a useful tool for income generation, I think, is a beneficial thing. Now, it's not the only reason that you'd want to have the Internet. It's access to information. It's the ability to help people learn how to be healthy, and how to be more educated, how to prepare themselves for jobs that don't even exist yet but will. It has all those salient properties as well. But my motivation primarily is to find ways of making the Internet as beneficial as possible for the people that get access to it. There's a lot of talk about the next billion users, to go along with your 80-20 observation. I'm worried about the last billion users. I want to try to make sure that we get to them too, preferably within my lifetime. I can't imagine anything more satisfying than believing that the system is really, truly available to everyone who wants to use it.
How do you balance off, you spoke there quite eloquently in terms of revenue, in terms of income. This last billion, to be very American on Wall Street about it, they're not really profit centers, are they? How do you balance the need to get to them against the needs of much of what seems to drive the Internet now, of large companies big data, advertising, monetization, activations, RPUs. How do you balance off all of those needs to get to that last section?
So that's a fair question. And I think companies that are driven by the business models you describe are not likely to be focused very much on the last billion users. They may be focused on the next billion because they are at the leading edge. They are a place where incomes are per capita are rising. My view is that in the long run, I think it should be our policy, not corporate policy, but let's say our national and even international policy, that we have to make it possible for everyone to participate in the global economy. And if we are able to achieve that, and Internet is not the sole means to do that that's not what I'm trying to say, but if we can find ways to do that, then many, many problems will be solved by that means. The most amazing success story, which I only recently learned about, is in Singapore. The country is about 50 years old. It wrested itself from Malaysia about 50 years ago. I was told while I was visiting there in January that, that the per capita income at the time of its creation was $500 per person, and that the 2016 per capita income is $56,000 per person. And I think, or per capita GDP, I misstated that. So, I mean, that's a factor of 100 over 50 years. It's astonishing. And in my visits there was a very palpable desire to try to share what they had discovered in the course of that 50 years with other places which are faced with the same challenge. In some cases, very few natural resources. In certainly many cases, a poorly educated population. In the end, education is the solution to so many problems. You hear it over and over again. I can't say it more emphatically that if the Internet can be helpful in creating an educated population, which enables them to become active participants in the economy, what's not to like about that?
Are you effectively talking about giving everybody on the planet some sort of computer?
I'm not sure that I would say that, although because we've seen the poor results of just giving people computers and then not maintaining them, and nobody knows how to fix them when they break or the battery dies and there's no place to recharge it. However, what I am saying, of course, is that in order to use the Internet, you need to have access to some kind of a device. But increasingly, we're starting to see some pretty interesting ways of getting access to the net, some of which are vocal interactions. We do this a lot at Google. And the interesting thing there is that you don't necessarily have to be literate in order to take advantage of that modality. And that can be a very powerful equalizer for people who have yet to learn to read and write. In the long run, they have to learn to read and write because that's the body of knowledge is mostly provided in that form. But I don't think that just giving somebody a computer is the solution to the problem. People have discovered how to use their smartphones pretty readily, even in some of the poorest populations. So I'm an optimist when it comes to people's ability to learn to put things to work. And I'm also an optimist when it comes to inventing new ways to use things that you didn't think of. And look, intelligence and brilliance is spread around the planet pretty uniformly. And it's just that sometimes it's not situated in a place where you can take advantage of it. The conditions are not there to allow a creative person to really engage. And you can see this happen a lot. Look at the American West Coast right now for just a moment. Think about two of the biggest companies on the planet, Google and Microsoft. Have you noticed that the two people who run those companies are from India? Now, they're two really, really smart guys. I would bet that if they had stayed in India, they might not have had the same opportunity as they have been afforded in the U.S. because the conditions were more, let's say, ripe to take advantage of their creativity and their intelligence and their capabilities. And I think that story gets told over and over again. So to the extent that Internet can help create conditions under which people's creativity can be exercised, then it too can contribute to an improvement in GDP.
But it also can't be done on its own. So to go very briefly into politics, there are a lot of countries around the world, not necessarily yours, not necessarily mine, that place many restrictions. You know, information is not necessarily free, travel is not necessarily free, and many countries do not see the internet as this sort of, let's just put that in and see what happens. And it's a thing that scares people. And you know, yes, it's really easy to look forward 50 years, but if I ask you to look forward only 50 months or 50 weeks, those are the harder goals, surely, the short-term ones. So what are those short-term goals that you're addressing right now to put in place what's needed for this vision in 50 years' time?
Okay, so there are several. The first one is finding new ways of delivering internet service to people, whether it's pulling up the streets and building fiber, or putting in super high frequency Wi-Fi at 85 gigahertz to give you a really, really broadband channel, or putting balloons up at 60,000 feet and dropping packets down from the sky, or making use of satellite technology like the O3B system, which is delivering gigabit spot beams, 10 of them per satellite, 40 degrees north and south of the equator. There are lots and lots of initiatives underway right now to bring the underlying technology to bear. The second thing, which is a really interesting idea that the people-centered internet has been pursuing, is to notice that there are major implementations of infrastructure going on right now, roads and dams and power generation plants and everything else. When you think about the mechanics of doing this, and then you ask yourself, hey, while you're at it, why don't you drop fiber in the ground, or why don't you put in radio towers? Because it's a small added expense in the midst of a multi-billion-dollar project, and yet the consequences of that could be quite dramatic, because now you'd be bringing access to Internet and its content and its capabilities to people that otherwise wouldn't have access. And so by putting together these various already justified initiatives, you actually allow these to mutually reinforce each other. It makes the internet makes the infrastructure more valuable. The infrastructure makes the internet possible. There are a whole series of advantages that come out of that. So over the next period of, let's say, 15 months to maybe, or even 15 weeks, I think you'll see serious attempts to latch these two kinds of initiatives together. And once those kinds of plans are in place, then you can invite other people to say, well, if you succeed in doing that, then what else can we do? This is called salami slicing, right? You find something you can agree on that you're willing to work on, and as soon as you've discovered something you can agree on, then you say, great, we've just agreed on this. What else can we agree on? And it's a wonderful way of making progress.
What about in the last, let's stay with that 15-week window then. What about in the last 15 weeks? What's been your people-centered internet success? What's been the last good salami slice?
Well, I think that we're still at very early stages of the people-centered internet, and I don't think I can blow my horn and say we've accomplished things as much as what we've mostly been doing is trying to understand which institutions are making investments in the infrastructure, significant ones, which ones are amenable to this idea of adding internet to the goals of the project. So we're way in too early stages to make any assertions about accomplishments, other than recognizing and having the insight that this is a very powerful way forward. I hope that the next time we have this interview, maybe in a year's time, I'll have some really concrete things to point to. But we're already looking at projects, for example, with the IEEE in Tunisia, for example, where we want to link internet with the educational system as well.
I've already brought it up. You've brought it up, the people-centered internet, which is what you're working with. Can you easily sum up the goals of that project?
We want to find ways to make the internet useful to people who have access to it, which means local information, local languages, local opportunity for business operation, enhanced facility to implement it, which is tagging along with other projects rather than having to stand alone by itself. And so we're looking for both the mechanism and people who are willing to engage to make it possible.
Normally when I do interviews like this, I go, do you have any advice for your younger self, if you could go back and say that? But I think that's a bit trickier here. So I want to spin it round.
Okay.
Was there anything your younger self got right that you now find surprising?
Yes, and I don't think that I necessarily knew at the time that this was going to happen. But I believed at the time we were doing the original internet work.
So the packet switching and TCP/IP, the sort of signposts and underlying, this is where the roads are.
Right, exactly. All of that technology development, which originally was motivated by a Defense Department initiative, which was to use computers for command and control. But what was interesting is it was graduate students who were doing the work in the academic community. And our values were all about sharing information and building on each other's ideas. I mean, the coin of the realm was sharing information. You didn't buy information from people. That theme permeated all that we did. It permeated the institutions that we created when we needed them. The IEEE, the Internet Architecture Board, the Internet Engineering Task Force, the Internet Society, ICANN, the regional Internet registries. All these institutions were created when they were needed, not at the beginning, but as we recognized the need for having them. And every single one of them has echoed this open, sharing, participatory, multi-stakeholder notion, including for policymaking. And I think we got that right.
What was it then about the graduates, about those people, that made sharing be such a fundamental part? What was it? Which bit of the psyche meant you were so hungry to do that?
Well, there were actually, in many cases, you'll find in the academic world, people hide information from each other because they're competing for grants and all these other things. But in the case of the Internet Project, it was the Defense Department that was funding this. And they basically said to the dozen or so universities involved in the ARPANET initially and then Internet, they said, we will fund all of you. Don't sweat that part. You don't need to hide from each other your discoveries and your capabilities. We want you to share the ideas, the computing power, and everything else, and we will fund all of that. And so they completely removed all the motivation for information hiding and created an incentive for information sharing, because what you got rewarded for the rapidity of your progress, which was enhanced by simply working together. And so this collaboratory element was fundamental, and it permeated everything we did, and it frankly permeated the way the Internet's design has unfolded.
Tell me something we don't know about that period.
Wow. Well, I think the honest thing is that I'm not sure we really knew what we were doing at the time and could not predict all of the outcomes. But to be honest with you, for me personally, let me just speak for myself, the thing that was the most intriguing about this whole networking thing is that you could do something somewhere and something would happen 3,000 miles away. I mean, there was just something cool about that. And it got better. I've been working with with NASA and with the Jet Propulsion Laboratory since 1998 on building an interplanetary extension of the Internet. It's in operation now between Earth and Mars and the International Space Station. And if you think something happening 3,000 miles away is cool, how about something 235 million miles away? That's really cool. And so just the idea that you could do something and affect things that were distant was just fun, and it was intriguing and exciting, and it still is.
Does that mean that we've looked at short term, we've looked at the long term, but we've only looked on this planet? Does that mean if we could somehow scoot forward 5,000, 10,000 years, the solar system is colonized, are we still using one of your lines of code?
Probably not. I mean, let's face it, software has a certain lifetime and then it sort of dies of its own weight. In fact, Internet may be replaced by something else well ahead of that. And whatever it is, I'm sure it will be. It will be better, because otherwise why would you replace it? So, on the optimistic side, I think that someday, maybe it's, a decade or less, maybe it's many decades from now, something else will come along and it will be even better. But the notion of being able to share information, communicate easily with each other is going to stick with us because we've all seen how powerful that can be.
Tell me how powerful it is and what sort of stories we can tell when we do connect the last person on the planet to the internet.
I think those stories will almost certainly be stories of opportunity and stories of success. When the last person is connected and has found the network and its content to be useful and has contributed to it, I think that will be the kind of story I will want to read. I've discovered that I can learn something from everyone, which means that everyone has something to say, something to teach about their own experiences. If you imagine for just a moment that all 7 billion people on the planet are like explorers in an intellectual landscape. They are exploring places you haven't been. Since you can't explore everywhere that all 7 billion people can go, learning from what they have discovered is a great value. And so for me, personally, once we get everybody up online, I have this wonderful opportunity to learn from all of them. What's not to like about that?
What's the last thing you learned?
Well, most recently, I've gotten very, very interested in how a cell replicates itself. And the reason I'm so interested in this is that when it's out of control, it's called cancer. And so I've started studying the microbiology of cells. Not that I have cancer, but I'm just really curious about this thing. And I've now discovered that a cell is more complicated than Manhattan. There's more stuff going on inside a cell than you would ever find in the city of Manhattan. It's an incredibly complex environment. So I got a hold of a book called, I think, The Microbiology of the Cell by Bruce Alberts and his colleagues. 1,766 pages of deep stuff. And if I could start my career all over again, I would want to study microbiology, because it's even more fascinating and complicated than anything we've ever invented.
Thus says the man who arguably contributed to the invention of the internet. If I could change it, I would give it all up and be a biologist. In a way, I'm glad you didn't.
Well, look, if you look inside the cell, what you discover is there's packet switching going on in there.
Oh, that's smooth.
I am serious about that, except Mother Nature figures out how to do it 3 billion years before we do. There are little chunks of protein that are being ferried from one part of the cell to another on little microtubules. They're labeled with other proteins to say where they're supposed to go. It's a packet switching system. And, I only learned about this in the last few months. And so it's sort of disappointing to discover that your brilliant idea turned out to have been invented by natural evolution billions of years before you figured it out.
And at that, I'm going to go, I've learned something as well, which makes my day. Vint, thanks very much for your time.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here.
It's a delight to have spent some time with you and to talk with you here at IEEE's Tech For Humanity series at South by Southwest. If people want to find out more about the People-Centered Internet, it's online and we can find out there.
It is indeed. If you go to peoplecentered.net, you'll find out everything you need to know.
Archduke Vint Cerf there, still evangelising the internet to all to this day. Peoplecentered.net also continues that mission to work for an internet that works for people. Thanks very much for listening. That interview was from the archive. We will have more of those coming out over the next weeks and months, and may well slip in some brand new interviews there as well. As always, it's on the internet, so link, like, love, share, subscribe, the usual follows, shares, blah, 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 blah. You know how that all goes. Thanks very much for your eyes and ears. Always appreciated. But for now, that was the interview. You've been listening to The Interview, a Spence Media production, hosted by Ewan Spence. Find out more at ewanspence.co.uk.